For joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event. My name is Robert Gregory, and also on the screen we have Dr. David Adler, the president of the AJA. As usual, if you'd like to ask a question, the best way is to raise your hand with the reaction button. Written questions can also be placed in the chat function, and if we have a chance, we may get to some, although as regulars know, we often don't have time for most of the questions. Now, tonight's topic is hatred from Gaza to Lakemba, looking at the issues underlying terrorism against Israel and Jews. Our guest, Henry Ergas AO, is an analyst and commentator on political issues, and arguably the most respected public policy analyst in all of Australia. Henry writes regularly for the Australian newspaper, where he's written on this very topic, as we just heard. We'll also briefly consider the outcome of the voice referendum and what it means for Australia moving forward. So tonight's format, as we heard, is going to be an interview-style discussion between David and Henry. So hand over to David to start the discussion.
Okay, Henry, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your interesting articles that you've done recently on the subject. Before the outbreak of the conflict, we were going to have you on to talk about the voice and its implications. Tell me, what's your interpretation of the outcome of the voice referendum?
Well, I think in many ways it's a resounding defeat for the voice, that's obvious. But to my mind, what's most important about it and about the outcome is that the referendum, however ham-fisted and ill-judged it was, raised a really crucial question. And that question is, what do we want this country to be? And how does that affect what Indigenous policy should be seeking to do? And that fundamental question really hasn't been addressed for many, many years. And so policy was drifting ever more in a separatist direction. And to my mind, what the referendum has resoundingly done is to call that separatist drift into question.
And we have seen that some of the state premiers are sort of tossing with the idea of doing their own version of the voice, ignoring, in effect, the outcome of the referendum. What do you think about that, the states perhaps running with some sort of pseudo voice?
Look, consultation is obviously a good idea, and that should be true across every area of policy. And I don't think anyone would oppose consulting the people who will be affected most directly by policies about those policies. The question is how you do that, and whether you should do that on an even-handed basis, or whether you should do it on a basis which, in a way, cements and entrenches a form of racial discrimination. To my mind, if you do that, be it at a state or a federal level, that is really a step backwards. It's an ominous step in terms of our long-term political development. I don't think any good can come of it. And I think it would be lamentable if, despite the resounding message of the referendum, they went further in that direction.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to our main subject, which, of course, is the conflict that has broken out, beginning on the 7th of October with the horrific terrorist attacks against Israel. You've written 2 articles in the last 2 weeks. The first is titled "From Hamas to Lakemba, This Was Evil at its Root." For those who haven't seen the article, what was the theme of it? What were the basic points you were making in that article, Henry?
Look, fundamentally, what I was trying to do was to address the nature of what we saw happening with those attacks. And to my mind, what was at the heart of that was evil. And I use the term advisor. It's one of the interesting things about the English language that in the 18th century, a separation occurred between evil and bad. And so really until then, these words were more or less synonymous, and there wasn't a great distinction between them. But in the 17th and 18th century, really coinciding with what is often referred to as the Enlightenment, those terms separated. And evil became something fundamental that was more than just a qualitative degree of badness. It was something existential. And though it's very difficult to define precisely, and in many ways even difficult to understand precisely because it's such a dramatic phenomenon, we know it when we see it, and we saw it on that day. And we can characterize its essence. And its essence is the denial of the humanity of the victim. That is the essence of evil. It's the complete denial of the other's humanity. That was the evil of Nazism. It was the evil we saw on that day in Hamas's action. But at the same time as we saw that evil, the evil of profound inhumanity, of Nazi-like inhumanity, with which there can be no compromise, okay? We also saw another form of evil, which was the evil that unfurled on the streets of Sydney in particular, but not only in Sydney, but in many places around the world. And that evil was not the same, did not have the same charge of violence, of physical assault that we saw in Israel, but it was a kind of evil that comes from thoughtlessness, from not being willing to engage with the underlying moral aspects of an issue. It was what the German philosopher Karl Jaspers and then later Hannah Arendt famously termed the banality of evil, an evil that was banal, an everyday evil. And that evil is every bit as pernicious, indeed in some forms more dangerous than radical evil, because it spreads, to use Hannah Arendt's favorite term, like a fungus across society, making it fundamentally unworkable. And so it's the need to address those evils that is really the imperative of the moment.
Oh, what happened? We had a whiteboard jump on. Okay. Sorry about that. There's actually quite a lot happening in the background, and I want to tell people that we have now turned off the chat, so you can type away to your heart extent, but nobody will see it. And again, somebody's managing to turn on the whiteboard, which is fascinating. Henry, this is an interesting experience because we have a couple of people in here who seem to be disruptors, and I'll just have to deal with them, but I may at times look a little bit distracted. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was, we've seen that almost a disregard for Arab Palestinians that are outside Israel, that are in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and of course, with the civil wars that have occurred, there are a lot that have been killed in Syria by Assad. What's your understanding of the difference? I mean, there seems to be a complete different attitude as to victims when it's related to Israel and victims that are not related to Israel.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, all you need to do is look at Syria, which is really one of the great tragedies of the 21st century. And so far, and this is data is some months old, so far 300,000 civilians have died in Syria. That's a staggering number, a third of a million people who had everyday lives have been destroyed in Syria. And there's also a lesson in that 300,000, which is the world's unwillingness and incapacity to intervene to prevent the massacres. And so there's a lesson in that, which is that Israel, as it faces what is Hamas and Hezbollah's, Iran's genocidal plans, cannot count on the rest of the world to save it. It has to deal with those threats on its own. And that, of course, is what it's attempting to do, and which will provoke, no doubt, a very strong, and as you say, biased reaction, profoundly biased reaction. But it's the unfortunate reality of the situation.
So how should we interpret what's happened in a number of Western countries, Australia included, where we've seen on the streets support for Hamas?
Well, you know, I think it's, look, I think it's a combination of things. And I think there's essentially two elements in it. The first element in it is that we know that Islamist propaganda has had a substantial grip on at least sections of Muslim communities around the world. And that's as true in Australia as it is elsewhere. And one aspect of that Islamist propaganda is hatred of Jews and the endorsement of every attack on Israel. So that's the first component, and that was obviously very present in the demonstrations that we've seen in Australia and around the world in recent days. There's a second component too, which is sort of a recrudescence of a kind of leftist third worldism, which views everything that's happening around the globe in terms of a struggle between the bad West and good opponents of the West, a sort of Manichaean conflict between good and evil playing itself out worldwide. And as far as that component of the left is concerned, it's a very simple issue where everything good is on one side, everything bad is on the other. It's a pattern that has been there for some time, but I think its underlying element, the element in it which is strongest, is its hatred of the West as a civilization. And in many respects, the clash between Israel and Hamas epitomizes that battle between Western civilization and what I regard not as another civilization, but as a form of barbarism. And the Israel has come to represent, in the eyes of the left, everything that it detests. It's a democracy, doesn't always function well. No democracy ever does. We all have our views about how it works and how it should work. And I'm sure those views will differ greatly in this virtual room as they do elsewhere. It's a democracy. It's a society that has prospered, that's very entrepreneurial, that has a significant component of science and technology. And it's a society that, despite everything, is relatively integrated. So 50% of pharmacists are Arabs, are Israeli Arabs. There's an Israeli Arab on the Supreme Court. You see Israeli Arabs everywhere. When you go to a doctor, when you go into a hospital, you see Israeli Arabs. You see them in the universities, in the best universities. And all that is anathema to a significant component of the left. And so here we have this curious phenomenon. The Greens, who detest religion, who support the most extreme forms of LGBTQI identity.
Yes.
Pairing up with Islamists who prefer to crucify gays and who are religious fundamentalists of an extremism that has rarely been seen in the world since the 18th century. And so that combination, almost against nature, is what we're seeing playing itself out in Australia with, in my view, disastrous consequences.
Yeah. Can you comment on this trend in some quarters to try to create a moral equivalence? What's your counter to that? That somehow what Israel is doing is comparable to what Hamas is doing?
Well, frankly, I think it's absurd. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. I don't want to get into academic or scholarly discussion of it, but to my mind, it makes very little sense. I mean, the reality of it is that there's a fundamental difference between murder and what happens rightly or wrongly in war. Murder is when you kill people with the intention of killing them. Your aim is to kill someone. And what we saw Hamas do was kill people who were clearly innocent, babies, children, the elderly, butcher them, decapitate. Right? That's murder. Okay? Now, what is happening at the moment in Gaza is that Hamas is again guilty of murder. It's guilty of murder by using captive civilians as a shield for its own operations. That's a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and is morally abhorrent. Israel has been placed in a position where it has to deal with Hamas. Unfortunately, given Hamas's conduct, that creates civilian casualties. But Israel's aim is not to cause those casualties. Israel's aim is not to murder the Gazans. Israel's aim is to disable Hamas, because until Hamas is disabled, there can be no peace and security, either in Israel or throughout the broader Middle East. To claim a moral equivalence in that situation between victims and executioners is, in my view, absolutely evil.
Well, we saw some of the media reporting of the conflict, Henry, as you know, has been extraordinary, and perhaps the litmus example has been the alleged bombing of the hospital, which wasn't a bombing of a hospital, it was a misfired Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. One of the worst offenders across the whole international media was our own ABC, that accepted the story immediately and was one of the last to make a correction. So here's the question for you. Why is it that people accept the word of a terrorist organisation without any verification, and then are so slow to actually listen to Israel's side and incorporate that in their coverage? And a lot of the media has been guilty of it. Some of them corrected reasonably quickly, and others, like the ABC, held on to the headline that Israel had bombed a hospital for basically all the day.
Yes. Well, look, that's a development that we've, in terms of what's happening in the media, that we've seen for some time now. It was, I think, one of the most important aspects of the development of the media in the late 19th and the 20th century was the attempt to more rigorously separate reporting from opinion. And it is in the nature of opinion that people's views will differ on this issue or on these issues, as on every issue. But what we've seen in recent years, for many complex reasons, is the complete blurring of that distinction, with the result that the dividing line between activism and journalism has virtually completely disappeared. And so where you have organizations such as the ABC, which have a very strong groupthink, element of groupthink to them, then you get an echo chamber within which this sort of misreporting occurs and persists. The Romans used to say that lies have wings and the truth stumbles behind. And that's really what we've seen on so many issues in recent years. The Voice was another issue where the ABC was really speaking with, if I may say, use the phrase, with only one voice. It was activism, not reporting. And of course, that's long been the case, I believe, on everything to do with the Middle East.
Absolutely. Now, I can see there's a whole series of questions lined up, but I just want to ask you one final thing. And that, of course, we can't complete the discussion without talking about the general rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen, Henry. I can tell you our organisation has received dozens of threats and dozens of reports. Now, you're in France, you spend a lot of time in France. What's your observation of how this has unleashed anti-Semitism in areas where people are not directly engaged in the conflict? And particularly in France, where there's a large Jewish community. How are things playing out in the streets, and how are the authorities responding?
Well, there certainly is a long-term rise in anti-Semitism that has accelerated in recent weeks and become more virulent and more violent virtually everywhere. I think that, as I was saying earlier, I think that's the result of the confluence of two developments. One, the first is the still growing penetration of Islamist fundamentalism in Muslim communities, and in Europe there are very large Muslim communities. And then the second development is the rise of leftist anti-Semitism, of a leftist anti-Semitism that has become increasingly widespread. And as you know, August Babel, the Austrian Marxist, referred to anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools. And what we're seeing in Europe, yet again, is that socialism of fools on the march, and it's a very ugly sight.
It is ugly.
The authorities obviously are concerned about it, and in France, for instance, there have been a large number of arrests, a number of prosecutions are underway for anti-Semitic violence and anti-Semitic rhetoric, and a number of Islamist mosques have been shut, and the process is in train, which will see the preachers running those mosques be expelled, or which should result in their being expelled. So there has been a relatively vigorous reaction, and it does disappoint me that we haven't seen an equally vigorous reaction in Australia.
No.
For instance, in France, quite a bit of Islamist anti-Semitic propaganda in Arabic has been seized, and the people distributing that propaganda are being prosecuted. My impression is that that propaganda is readily available in Australia, and no attempt is made to prevent its distribution. And that, in my view, is really not merely lamentable from a moral standpoint, but extremely dangerous from the standpoint of maintaining a civilized, harmonious society.
Yeah. Okay. I'll hand back in a moment to Robert to run the questions, but just before I do, I'll do our 1 minute promo. And as we always do, at the end of this event, if you are not yet actively supporting AJA, please go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, where you can become a supporter. You can make a donation, please. We do need resources at this time. Make sure you like and follow our Facebook page for updates, usually multiple times a day, on news and views. And I should add, you can join the email list at the website as well. Now, we're not going to make a specific announcement about next week. We're still working on getting a special guest, and that hasn't been confirmed. But I am going to foreshadow to you something really interesting that we've achieved in Israel advocacy. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with The Spectator magazine. So I'm going to show you what this week's cover published in a couple of days will look like. Obviously, it's the yellow star with never again. And this is in large part driven by AJA, part of our advocacy. And you can see that I actually have the cover story for the Spectator magazine this week, really making a harsh critical review of Labor policy and the providing of funds to Palestinian territories without appropriate controls. And I suspect that this will have a bit of an impact in the discussion subsequent to its publication.
Wow, what a cover.
Yeah, it's one of those really powerful covers, Robert. So we have a number of questions. You can call who and I'll ask them to unmute.
A lot of questions. Alan, you're first up. Let's ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and thanks, Henry, for your articles every week. One thing I can be sure of is that every Saturday morning I'm going to open the Australian and see lots of letters congratulating you. So thank you for everything that you do. My question is this. Over the years, some in the Jewish community have engaged in interfaith activities with the Islamic community. Others of us have been a bit more sceptical about the value of it. But it's interesting, I think, that if I'm correct, not one Muslim Islamic association or organisation has actually come out and expressed condemnation of what Hamas has done, let alone support for Israel. And this has been of great astonishment to the people involved in interfaith. So I'm just wondering, what do you make of this, and what does that tell us about the future of these sorts of interfaith activities?
Well, look, I am not heavily involved in them, so I'm not very well placed to judge. My own impression is that, of course, one should discuss issues with people of every persuasion, religious, political, or otherwise, and I would be in favor of that. But I think we also need to recognize that there is a deep-seated anti-Semitism which has regrettably become quite pervasive in large parts of the Islamic world, and that anti-Semitism, which has been fanned over the years for political reasons by essentially politically bankrupt elites, that anti-Semitism is now so strong that it sets the tone. And so even in countries where the regime is moderately sensible, such as Morocco, say, we find it constrained by pervasive anti-Semitism amongst the population. And that is, in my view, going to be very hard to change and may indeed become worse in the period ahead, which does not fill me with a great deal of optimism.
Okay. Michael, do you want to be next? You can unmute and ask your question, Michael.
Henry, I'm as a Jew, I'm concerned about immigration. Up till now, the Jewish communal organizations have been pushing the theory that the far right and the neo-Nazis are the biggest threat to Jewish interest in Australia, where we all know that the anti-Zionism is now anti-Semitism, and the real problems are coming from with extremists within the Arab and Muslim communities. We've seen what's happened in Europe. Should as a Jewish community member, should we be concerned about the problem that Europe and Scandinavia are having that we're already having here in a small way, but is likely to increase? Should we be concerned as Jews?
Well, look, one of the things that I think has become absolutely apparent in recent weeks, tragically apparent in recent weeks, is that the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, between anti-Zionism and hatred of Jews, is a very largely artificial one. It is striking that wherever you look in the world, what happened immediately after Hamas's attacks? Was it Israeli embassies that needed to be fortified? Was it the headquarters of Zionist organizations that needed additional security? No, it was Jewish day schools, synagogues, Jewish shops, areas where Jews lived. We've seen that in Paris, you see it throughout Europe, we've seen it in Australia. And what that tells you is that these people who need to be monitored and controlled, these violent extremists, make absolutely no distinction between Zionists and Jews. And the claims that they do are, and in my view, always have been, almost entirely pretextual and artificial. So what does that mean for your question? Well, to my mind, what it means for your question is that we need to be very careful about who we admit into Australia. Let me be clear in this respect. There are Muslims who are not at all anti-Semitic. I have many friends with whom I've worked for years who are not. And I respect them, and I respect also their independence of mind. But there are significant numbers who are deeply anti-Semitic. And we know from detailed studies, and particularly in France and Germany and Scandinavia, Netherlands, that growing up in an anti-Semitic household is a sure indicator of later anti-Semitism. And so there's now an intergenerational transmission of Islamist anti-Semitism, which is extremely dangerous. And so it's not just the people, that the consequences aren't merely with the immediate people we let in. We are, as it were, breeding future generations that will, through no fault of their own, be burdened with this paranoid view of Jews and of Judaism. And so we really want to be extremely confident that we're not undermining our social fabric by admitting into Australia people who will be a danger to the Jewish community, or for that matter, to any other community.
Yeah, I mean, that's been our experience as well. We've had individual Muslims reach out and, say they were disgusted by what the terrorist attacks, but there's been, I think it was mentioned, there's been no Muslim cleric in the entire of Australia that has unequivocally condemned the terrorist attacks. So I think that says a lot about the leadership of that community. And that's someone who has something to say about that, who's got quite the stories, Neil Kafakis. Maybe you can just unmute and...
I'll add for Henry's benefit. Neil is a good friend of AJA. He's a Syrian refugee and all-round good guy.
Amazing guy.
Good evening. Hi, Henry. Hi, guys. Henry, I don't want to ask you a question. I want your opinion with this. First point, as the guy said, I am from Syria. I arrived as a refugee with this immigration things coming to Australia. About what happened, I just want to tell everyone is hearing me this. I think everything everything we are watching around us, all this pro-Palestinian things against Israel, against the Jewish people, no, but against these innocent people happen, and what happened there in Israel. You guys, you need to know something. It's not about Palestine. It's about non-Muslim killing Muslim people, especially Jewish and Christians. When Jewish and Christians killing Muslims people, that's it for them. That's the story. If tomorrow China remove all the Uyghur Muslims in millions from the history, or remove them from the land, nobody will say anything. If tomorrow Bashar Assad bombed all Gaza from Syria, nobody will say anything. Their problem is that it's not Muslim people killing Muslim people, especially Jewish and Christians. And we saw this before in Iraq, and we saw this in Afghanistan, and we saw this in my country. That's the first point. The second point about what's happening here in Australia, let me tell you that really I am shocked. I'm surprised. I'm feeling fear, really. I'm not feeling safe. What happened in Australia showing me that really we have a very weak political side, very weak system, let me say. And about the immigration and the people coming, and that we should be aware. I'm very sorry, guys, to tell you that it's too late.
Neil, we're going to have to get you to your point, because we'll have you back as a speaker, but tonight you're not.
Yeah, I know. No, it's okay. But we need to go to Plan B now, because this is the third generation. The people were going in front of Opera House.
Okay.
It's definitely a problem. A lot of people need to be deported. And over to you, Henry.
Yeah. And thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Let's go to Helen.
Helen, you can unmute and ask your question. There you go.
Am I unmuted?
Yes. Yes, you're with us. Oh, you just muted yourself again. Try to unmute again.
Thank
Okay.
you. Following on from what the last speaker said and what Mr. Ergas has been saying of the lack of response from the Australian authorities to what's going on, I am concerned with the lack of response of the Jewish community in Australia. Specifically, what has been occupying my mind very much over the last 48 hours is the Jewish Film Festival, which is now taking place in the Classic Theatre in Elstonwick, suburb of Melbourne, inner suburb of Melbourne. To my horror, I have been down there to see that there was no guard in the morning. The doors are open, there is no guard there. I went in the afternoon and there was quite a lot of people, activity going on, and there is a guard, a single guard. He is not asking anybody to open their bag to show them what's in there. He is politely saying good afternoon as people are going through. It is a total lack of security. And you have a concentration of 300-400 Jewish people in one place with practically no security.
I mean, on particular security issues, I'm not sure this is the right forum. Like, I know obviously CSG and the community is up security at all venues. Even a lot of the time you can't see them, but they're there. But I'm not sure. Is there a particular question for Henry on that?
The question is, does he think that we are at a stage in Australia where we should be having responsible security as they do in Israel?
Yes, I very much believe so. And of course, that's a very unfortunate sign. I mean, why should we have to worry about a Jewish film festival? Our greatest worry about a Jewish film festival should be the quality of the films, which sometimes are good, other times, well, let's not talk about them. It's an indicator of the tragedy that we now face, that we do have to worry a great deal about those situations, as you rightly point out.
Okay, who we got next?
Victor. Always good to see Victor.
Victor. You can unmute and ask Victor.
Oh, Henry, thank you so much. I would have lots of questions to ask.
One quick one, Victor.
I couldn't find myself to the main one that's been exercising in my mind daily. My concern is that we've been too, and first of all, let me say that AJA is doing an extraordinary job, just an extraordinary job, and above and beyond, I guess, any expectations people could have had. But my concern has been for some time before these events, at least for close to 2 years, that we approach this question of anti-Semitism too intellectually. We send our people, presidents, vice presidents, whatever they are, to these different government bodies, and we seem to think that we've done a job and we've succeeded or not succeeded. Let's pat ourselves on the back. I've taken the view that the real audience, and particularly now, all the more so, is the public. And I'm concerned that we as Jews, and perhaps to some extent this may apply to AJA, they'll know their own statistics, that we as Jews are so busy weeping in each other's palms and not out there saying to non-Jews, approaching Muslims that we know, and educating the public about who we are. And it's and I would ask you, that's my question.
Okay,
I draw a parallel with The Voice, with the Australian public.
We'll ask for Henry's response at this point.
Okay.
Well, look, I agree that everywhere Jewish communities need to be much more active and direct in terms of dealing with and responding to anti-Semitism. And you're right that it's one thing to discuss anti-Semitism in academic terms, and I, to some extent, have been guilty of that. And it's another thing to deal with it in reality. And it's a very difficult thing to do, but it's absolutely indispensable.
Yeah. Shoshana, do you want to? You're not a usual question asker, so can you unmute and ask your question? Shoshana? No.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm unmuted. Okay. Okay, don't yell at me this time, David. I'll get to the question fast.
Fast, please.
Okay. The intelligentsia amongst the left wing claim that their ideology inspires them to react in a way that they have. Is this an ideology that they have, or is it just a means to create anarchy, destroy the West, and perhaps perceive Jewish people and our morality as a way of thwarting their ambitions?
It's an interesting question.
Well, to my mind, it is an ideology. They do have a comprehensive view of the world. In fact, one of the problems is that that comprehensive view of the world is so all-encompassing and all-englobing that it really makes it very difficult for them to test their opinions, to even see what they see with their eyes. They're at the point of a kind of learned blindness. And inherent in that ideology, precisely the risks that you point to, the risks that really what they're reacting against, often with an element of rage, is the West, is the history of our entire civilization with all of its flaws and all of its great merits. And unfortunately, so far, we found it terribly difficult to respond to that adequately, with the result that, for instance, in the universities, it's becoming ever more prevalent with disastrous consequences. in areas that stretch from the private sector through the public sector through to organizations such as the ABC.
Robert, you there? You want to call the next?
But Tusk, we don't usually get questions from Helen, so if you want to ask a question.
Hello. Firstly, I really love Henry Ergas's columns. My question is, with the misinformation and disinformation bill, I see that as impinging upon, well, not only political freedom, and freedom of speech, but also religious freedom. And as a Christian who supports Israel, I might add, I see that as being really dangerous for well, every religion. I just wondered if you thought it would impact on your Jewish religion, Judaism in this country, this bill.
Yes, I think that legislation is extremely dangerous, and it's extremely dangerous because fundamentally what it does is it creates crimes of opinion. And once you create crimes of opinion, then it's very difficult to keep the boundaries of that criminalization under control. What it will do is it will create a field day for everyone who feels aggrieved about any expression of opinion, adding to what is already an overuse of our legal system to stymie views which are in general unpopular. The measure of a society's vitality and its ability to progress is, in many respects, the range of opinions it's capable of tolerating without that toleration giving way to rage, hostility, and outright violence. What we see at the moment is, on the one hand, this extraordinary rage that is expressed, for instance, in social media, and on the other hand, the rise of these crimes of opinion, which will be used by those people who are expressing that rage to punish the views they don't like. And so it's an extremely ominous development, and one that, in my view, needs to be seriously combated.
Right. All right, we've got so many hands raised. We won't be able to reach everyone, but maybe we'll try someone we haven't ever heard from before. Julian, do you want to just ask your question as quickly as you can?
Hi, Henry. Julian Toll here. Hello again. Can you comment on the Abraham Accords and whether that should be a source of some optimism for this entire messy region?
Yes, I do believe they are a source of optimism, and I think one of the paradoxes of the situation that we are now confronting is that it is, in many respects, the result of Israel's success rather than of its failure. Of course, the attacks themselves were a terrible security failure, and that will need to be investigated and addressed. But the reason for the attacks was the fact that Israel was succeeding in a broad range of fronts. I believe the Abraham Accords are perhaps one obvious aspect of that success. Israel's increasingly close relationship with India is another important aspect of that success. But I would say, even with respect to Gaza, what was happening with Gaza? Well, the policy that the government of Israel had adopted of increasing the number of work permits, allowing people to come into Israel to work, that was a real threat to Hamas. And one of the things Hamas hoped to achieve, and Iran, of course, behind it in seeking that goal, one of the things Hamas wanted to achieve was to completely destroy that dynamic. And the challenge for Israel now is both to address the security threat, the existential threat that Hamas poses, and yet create the grounds for that dynamic to continue in the years ahead.
Well, I think we're just up to time here. Is that right, David?
Yeah, I think look, we could take one very quick last.
One more, Mr. Cohen. Would you like to really quickly ask your question, and then we might have to go again?
Okay, let me just get back up to the question askers. Who did you call?
Mr. Cohen should be unmuted. Good to go. Ask away.
Is he there?
Is that me?
Yes, go for it.
All right. Thank you, Henry, and also Neil, for your comments. Over the last 200 or 300 years, about a third of the countries of the world have adopted as their culture values in common with the Judeo-Christian teachings. The other two separate thirds who haven't have been either the Muslims or the left side of the politics there. Which is the more dangerous, and how do we approach each of these elements?
Well, that's a very big and very good question, and we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, to discuss what is a very important question. I think there's no doubt that the broad framework of the political tradition that has come out of the Judeo-Christian traditions, that broad framework is under attack. It's under attack from every component of the world that is not, as it were, within it. And it's under attack within it too, which makes it the situation even more perilous in many respects. If I had to choose between your two components, as it were, if I had to rank them, and I'm not sure that's readily done, as it were, the Islamic component and the sort of component associated with the broadly what was once the socialist world, I would say a fundamental difference is that in at least a part of the Muslim world, that part that's dominated by Islamism in its most fundamentalist and most virulent variety, there is a millenarian apocalyptic, almost paranoid mindset that you don't really find to the same extent elsewhere. And we know from fascism and Nazism, we know from long experience that it's that apocalyptic mindset that is particularly dangerous. And so in terms of ranking those two elements of the world, I think that element has the greater potential for an almost combustive explosion. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about, for instance, what's happening in China, which does pose a fundamental security threat to our region and one that needs to be managed.
100%. The China issue is definitely a whole nother big issue going on. Well, just want to thank you so much, Henry. You're as good in spoken word as you are in written word, and you can see we had well over 200 people on Zoom alone, so a lot of people listening. Unfortunately, couldn't reach all the questions, but thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for inviting me along.
Thank you, Henry. And we look forward to reading your column every week.
Yeah, everyone can
Thank
keep
you. I really appreciate that. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again.
In the Australian, what a man. Yeah, so thanks everyone. And as David mentioned, you can keep up to date with AJA on all our social media. Instagram's very active, as well as Twitter, Facebook, all of them, the biggest of any Australian Jewish organization. And if you haven't yet, become a member, sign up to the emails, make a donation if you can. And yeah, next week we'll have an Israel update where I'm just confirming the speaker. So should be another really good speaker, but good night to everyone. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.